Welcome back. We are now going to go straight back to where I left off, which is we're going to start talking about the latter half of the slides, which is all about the Second World War, particularly focusing on the Holocaust. Holocaust, I'm never sure on how I want to say it, I have to admit. So what we're going to be doing now is it's quite intense content. It's a little bit I've put in quite a bit of pictures, so please just be aware that the content that I'm dealing with now might be somewhat challenging. I have put some trigger warnings for those of you who aren't really ready for it. We're doing it. The main things are genocide, death, violence, and anti-Semitism. But this section is heavy. It's dense. It's quite emotive. And I mean, the entire text is very difficult to deal with because of that emotion, but it is important to keep in mind everything we're doing is real. This really happened. So what I'm trying to do in this first section is really drive that point home. So I've started with a quote by Adorno, who was one of the philosophers who was writing, he was an art critic, and he was writing after World War II. And in fact, in 1969, he made this statement about World War II, which has to be something that has resounding sort of ripples that have gone through the art world since. And one of his quotes were, "To write a poem after Auschwitz is barbaric." And he basically claimed that to write art after what happened in World War II and the Holocaust was barbaric, and it was not possible. There could be nothing beautiful created after we had done such awful, awful things to people. And I want you to keep this in mind, because this quote from Adorno, this sort of resounds with our main writer, Arch Spiegelman, because the way he is creating art, he really struggles with this. He struggles with, can he create art out of Holocaust content? And it is a conversation that you should possibly think about having, is whether you can create art out of something as enormously tragic like this, with books that are doing incredibly well. For example, Fugitive Pieces by Anne Michaels, The Book Thief by Mark Zuzak, and most recently, The Tattooist of Auschwitz, and I don't actually know the author's name there. But you will find that there is now fiction being written about this, which at the time was incredibly complex to deal with, because how do you write fiction about a fictional event that pretty much shaped the modern European world? So let's talk a little bit about Arch Spiegelman first. He has a much longer name, but he goes by Arch Spiegelman, and he was born in Poland, and then his father managed to get him to America after World War II. I'm pretty sure he was born in I think his older brother might have been born in Poland, and he was born later in America. Sorry, I think that might be a correction on my part. And during the late 70s, 80s, and 90s, he chronicled the survival story, or the survivor story, of his father, who went to Auschwitz. Not his mother's story, because his mother committed suicide in 1968, so much earlier than that. And what he's doing, though, is in the book MAUS, in the comic book or the graphic novel MAUS, he is contrapuntally comparing his father's survival story and his modern complex relationship with his father in modern America, and how these two time periods seem to be almost at odds, and his experience is so drastically different. So this is just a little bit of pictures. I want you to understand the gravity of what we are dealing with, because we have yet to see anything on the sheer volume of what happened in World War II since then. There have been genocides since. We've had Rwanda. We have had various other genocidal attacks, but nothing quite to the level of the extermination camps of World War II with the Holocaust. So these are pictures of every pair of glasses that were confiscated from people coming into the camps. And they did this with several objects. There was glasses, there are piles of shoes, there are piles of watches, there are piles of wallets. Anything of value was stripped from these people to keep them from identity. These uniforms, the blue and white stripes, was very indicatory of, a concentration camp. inmate is I suppose, the most appropriate word to use there. This is the swastika. I'll talk a little bit about it later. Quite important to recognize. This was dug up from the mass graves of places like Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, places where there were extermination camps. You need to be aware of what Hitler looked like. So I put Hitler here because you need to be familiar with his face for what we're going to do later. And this is just an image of one of the tattoos that were on the inmates of the camps, and they were each allocated a name. So think about how Nelson Mandela was given his number for Robben Island, and how that ended up defining so much of his identity. This is something that very much has identified many, many, many people after World War II. So people, survivors, they still have these tattoos, and those numbers still resonate very strongly with them, because as soon as you give someone a number, you strip away their identity. You take away their name and their personalization. You give them something in which they are no longer considered human, and that's part of that process. And we're going to spend a lot of time talking about dehumanization, but this is one of the methods that the World War II, the Nazis used. So just a brief history. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but basically what happened was the World War II was fought between two groups. The first was called the Allies, who ended up winning, versus the Axis powers, who lost. It was between 1939 and 1945. The Allies were France, Great Britain. So when I say Great Britain, that includes Wales, Scotland, and Ireland. America, the Soviet Union, which is now we know as Russia, with a little bit of assistance from China, and almost every colony had given forces to the various countries that were involved. So, for example, we had many, many South Africans that were fighting in the war alongside the British. There was Namibians fighting alongside the Germans. It was a very complex time. The Axis powers were Italy, Germany, and Japan. Arguably, you could include Vichy France, which is a portion of France that supported Hitler or gave in to Hitler. So you can that's a lot of the war was fought in France. So it was more like the space in which the battles were taking place, less so than one of the actual people taking part. They suffered probably alongside the Germans and the Polish the most. A lot of the issues were attributed to the problems that came out of World War One. So it's quite difficult to explain World War II without knowing the issues that came out of World War One. And I don't think that that's hugely relevant for this. But what you do need to know is that, including civilians, there was an estimated 40 to 50 million people died over 6 years. That is the highest and the bloodiest conflict we have ever seen. And something to keep in mind is that this was the first time tanks were being used. It was the first time that there was modern air warfare. So what they call a dogfight, which is two planes fighting in the air, that was the first time it was used. And it was the first time machine guns were used. Before now, there was no such thing as a repeating rifle. So you'd shoot one bullet and then you have to reload your gun. But now you could have an entire cartridge of 300 or 400 bullets that could decimate an entire section. So this is the setting and the time period. The Holocaust is a specific event that occurred during World War II. And it was an extermination project, and I'm calling it that because that's really what Hitler wanted it to be, controlled by the Nazis. And the aim was to eradicate the European Jewish community as well as the Romani population. So to those of you who don't know what the Romani are, they are what we perceive to be gypsies. And it's a very specific cultural group that is scattered like the Jewish population across most of Europe. The queer population were negatively affected, and something that we don't talk a lot about, but we should know, is that anybody who was mentally or physically disabled were often just put straight into the concentration camps because they were not seen to be as good members of society. So if you were deformed, you were mentally ill, you would either be put into a concentration camp or often, horrifyingly enough, in hospitals. If you were mentally disabled, they would just let you die. Even though there was nothing physically wrong, they would kill you through starvation and so on. It was an incredibly brutal project of killing anybody that Hitler didn't want around. And it was approximately 11 million civilians, 6 million were specifically European Jewish communities. So Jewish communities from France, from Poland, from any area that the war was being fought on, any Jewish people would sort of be taken as soon as possible and sent to these concentration camps like Auschwitz, Dachau, Chelmo, and Sobibor, which were scattered between Germany and Poland, and they would either there be put to work or they would be put to death. Okay, so these are kind of some of the ideas I think you really need to be aware of during this time before I even go into the analysis of MAUS. The first is fascism, which we will talk about just now, and what the Nazis were. What were the symbols that were so powerful during this period? What a concentration versus a killing camp is, and the genocide versus eugenics, genocide and eugenics. So having a quick conversation about the Nazis. The Nazis was the name given to the followers of Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler, obviously, not only is he a very important figure in history, but he's an important figure in this book because although he is not personally present in MAUS, his shadow casts throughout the entire book. And in fact, his image, or the image of him with his very famous moustache, which makes him so recognizable, is on the front cover of MAUS, which we will look at in the next set of lectures. On the flag is the swastika. In case you're wondering why it was chosen as a symbol, it's actually a Hindi symbol that has been bastardized by the Nazis. And what it reflects is that no matter how much you hit this shape, it will always end up on its feet and it will keep going. So it's the sort of never-ending cycle. And it started out as a positive image of being something that would triumph over all adversity, but it obviously became something incredibly negative for what it represents as part of the Nazi fascist regime. So fascism was developed by the Nazis and the Italians at this time, and it's a far-right movement. It's very authoritarian, very nationalistic to whichever nation is being used by it, and it is ruled by a dictator. So in the case of World War II and Germany, it would have been Adolf Hitler. There is a forcible suppression of any opposition. So that means that anybody who comes into contrast, anybody who disagrees with the politicians would immediately be put down, whether through violence or through imprisonment or anything that sort of coincided with that. And there was a regimentation of society, which means that society was governed, and something to think about is how similar this sounds to a lot of what's happening in the world now. There would be things like you would have times that you were allowed to be out of the house, so you would have curfews. People would be allocated work to do. People would be given a very specific set of behaviors that was acceptable versus behaviors that were not acceptable. And it was a very specific set of identities that people had to ascribe to in order to be part of the Nazi regime. And something to keep in mind is I'm saying very loudly and very specifically Nazis because not every German at this point in time was a Nazi supporter. Many, many, many weren't. And a lot of them were, sort of, somebody put Adolf Hitler in power. They put Adolf Hitler in power. Very bad decision. And there was a very strong movement against it. But in order to be a Nazi, you needed to buy into this fascist movement. You needed to agree with the fascist movement. And fascism is actually quite a big topic of conversation at the moment because there's a lot of arguments about the way that some countries are being ruled is sort of tending towards fascism at the moment. So this is something that is surprisingly relevant at the moment for you guys to just sort of keep your eyes on. The next thing I want to do is talk about the power of symbols, particularly during World War II. So the first thing I'm showing you here is, I think this is useful to keep in mind, this is the uniforms and the symbols that were put on the uniforms by the Nazis to sort of classify people. And they were given, if you were Jewish, you would have the Star of David. And then if you fell into any of the other categories, so if you were Roma, so for example, if you were a Romani member, you were given brown. If you were gay, you were given pink. If you were red, it was a political prisoner. Everything was sort of classified, and whatever your star said or whatever your symbol said represented who you were. It classed you amongst a group of people. And this is another example of one of the, this is an actual print of, so Jut or Jut, Jut would be the German pronunciation, representing the Jewish population. And you would have to wear the star if you were Jewish. I've not put the swastika again, but I have put the emblem of the SS. Now, the SS were the population or the group of people that enforced the Nazi belief system, and they enforced the concentration camps. And interestingly enough, it got so bad after World War II that they actually developed a new symbol to replace two S's being next to each other in a German word. And it's still to this day, you will not find a German person using SS together in a word. They will use this symbol. And the swastika is obviously banned. And the idea that I'm trying to convey here is that World War II was a great example of when symbolism became so important, and how if you put somebody under a specific symbol, you could control and group them amongst a group of people, and therefore control their behavior, control how they exist, and control how people treated them in the future. And this is something that is going to be incredibly pervasive throughout MAUS. But it is also something that resonates with us now. Think about what symbols, how you react to seeing something on someone. Do you react to somebody who's wearing a specific religious symbol? Do you react to somebody wearing a specific icon, whether it's positively or negatively? This was a time where we realized how important symbols, logos, icons were, and how dangerous they can be, because we can sort of paint and tar everyone with one brush conveniently because we have a symbol to allocate to them. The next thing I want to talk about is just the concentration camps. So I've put two maps here. The one is Germany and the other one is Poland. Much of the actual killing camps were in Poland, ironically enough. So there were some definitely in Germany, but the big ones like Treblinka, Dachau, Chelmo, and Auschwitz were in Poland, which had been annexed by Germany. So what they did is they went into Poland and they took Poland as their own land, and they controlled it. And they made these camps there because there was a large Jewish population, and they set up the camps there, and it was easy to get people into Poland. Just through the various means, and a lot of the time they would use trains to do so. This is not the first time concentration camps have been used. Concentration camps have actually been used in South Africa during the South African War, the first and the second one. And it's not an unusual thing, concentration camps where you group specific groups of people together because you think that they are a danger. In America, they did this to the Korean and to the Japanese population for a while during World War II because they thought that they were a risky population group. And in fact, if anybody is a fan of George Takei, he grew up in a concentration camp in America. So concentration camps were not unique to Germany at this point in time, but Germany put them to the most, I'm going to say, effect, because they were something that we are very familiar with. The imagery that is associated with these concentration camps is very familiar to us. Some of them were used just to put people through labor and work, while others were used just for the purposes of killing. Something to keep in mind is at this point in time, many people died not because of the killing or the work. Many people just died of starvation. And there were some incredibly violent situations where people would be starved to death because they were it was not seen as necessary to feed these people. Something else that happened was what was called a death march, where they would take a group of people from one camp and they would walk them across in the middle of winter, across an entire portion of the country to another concentration camp, and you would just be expected to die along the way. The Germans would be in cars and in tanks, and so they didn't have to drive, they didn't have to walk, but the prisoners would just have to walk. And in fact, the father in Archbishop's MAUS does exactly this. He goes on a death march. And the last thing I want to talk today about is genocide and eugenics. So the genocide refers to the active extermination of a specific racial group. And in this term, it doesn't necessarily just need to be racial. It could be cultural. It could be cultural, religious, whichever. In this case, it is a racial, cultural, and religious group, which was the specifically Jewish community. But genocide is when you have picked up on a specific category of people because of something that holds them together, and you've decided to kill them. So this is what the Holocaust was. And Hitler did this because he had some very strong anti-Semitic views. So anti-Semitic meaning anti-Jewish. He disliked Jewish communities because he had several experiences of them as a young artist when he was trying to paint. And he perceived them as being more successful than he was. And he was very angry about this. He also believed in something called eugenics. And eugenics, I've given the dictionary definition here, is the study of how to arrange reproduction within a human population to increase the occurrence of heritable characteristics regarded as desirable. And that's a very fluffy way of saying he wanted the entire world to look a specific way. And so he tried to breed children and groups of people to look a specific way. And I put a picture of the young Nazi associations of exactly what he wanted. He wanted blonde-haired and blue-eyed people, and he thought that would be best that everyone looked like that. And he wanted genetically to reproduce this en masse. One of the things that we know about the Jewish community is that they don't have blonde hair, blue eyes for the most part. And so he wanted to exterminate anybody who fell into the Semitic group of people, but anybody who didn't fit his ideal version of what a good German person should look like. And this is where a lot of his ideas have come from, much to the tragedy of 11 million people. So what I've done here again is I've got a couple of videos that might be very useful for you. Some of them are actual summaries of World War II in case you want a little bit more context. I've gone through this quite quickly because I don't want us to get bogged down in historical events. But there are some very useful videos that tell you actual event sequence, when the Holocaust started, when it ended, the different phases. I really like how the Holocaust happened. I really enjoyed this one. I think it's a very useful breakdown of what the separate steps were that led to the Holocaust happening and how we let it happen. And then what I'd like you guys to do now is I've created a little quiz for you. It is the pre-MAUS quiz. So what it is it's all about history. And there you guys can go and do that. It's quick and it's self-marking. So it'll mark itself for you and you'll get immediate results. And it's just a quick check that you recognize what we've talked about. So you know what we're going into next, which is the breakdown of MAUS. And before I see you for the next set of slides, please make sure you do the reading called Postmodern Graphic Novels by Gregory Golder. It's on page 3 of your English 3B reading pack. It's not too long and it's a very useful reading. It also gives a lovely definition of postmodernism versus modernism for you to engage with in reference to our previous set of slides. And that's what I'm going to leave for now. Thanks, guys. I will see you in the next set of slides.